So I've made several videos criticizing the modern state of Tai Chi and all that, but the question is, what should we be doing about it? And this is where one of the things I want to address, and one of the things I want to work towards, are some of the basic assumptions and fixing some of the basic assumptions that we have about Tai Chi. Because I think one of the issues that's happened is that we've received a very fragmented pool of knowledge, right? So, because most people in the America and Europe who received Tai Chi received it from at a very specific time, so mostly in the 70s. So it's from a specific generation of Tai Chi teachers that came from China or Taiwan. But so we have the knowledge that they started passing down. But the knowledge that they themselves had was not necessarily complete. So we have essentially, we're playing telephone, a game of telephone. So we're receiving information from people who they themselves didn't have a full, complete set of information. And now we're kind of transmitting all this knowledge. And we've made assumptions about what Tai Chi is and what Tai Chi should look like and what Tai Chi should do that I think are preventing us from really exploring Tai Chi. Part of it is from a good place. It's basically respect for the people who taught us Tai Chi, respect for the elders, the masters that came here. And they deserve the respect. But I think what that's done is it fixed us in a specific time within kind of the Tai Chi tradition. And you see that most clearly in push hands, how there's so many push hands competitions that essentially, by doing, for example, fixed step push hands, are preventing Tai Chi itself from growing as a martial art. Because the problem with fixed step push hands is that it's meant to be an introduction to what comes next, and we've stopped at the introduction instead of really going in. So, for example, fixed step push hands. The reason why it's fixed step is so that you don't have to worry about stepping and all of that kind of stuff. You can focus on what's happening internally and some of the basic principles. But you're meant to then take those principles and apply them fuller into moving step push hands, into wrestling, into sparring and all that kind of stuff. All the stuff that we usually don't do in push hands and in Tai Chi in general. So, and so that's one of these kind of blind spots. Like, why aren't we doing more? Why are we stopping at essentially the beginning of push hands instead of moving on? Why are we recognizing push hands as a learning tool, right? So what we should be asking is, what are we supposed to be learning? What are the steps that are built into push hands? What are the principles? So it's the same with the form, right? Where I think we get caught in the performance of the form, and we stop asking, why are we going slowly? How are we supposed to be doing the form? What skills are we supposed to be developing by doing the form, right? Same with a Taoist meditation. And there's a ton in kind of Neigong, Qigong practices. Which one should be applied to Tai Chi? All of them? Some of them? None of them? These are questions that we should be asking, because actually there's a through line that has been muddled or hidden that we need to recover. There's a specific way of learning. There's a little specific set of skills that we're supposed to know as Tai Chi practitioners that most of us don't. And it's not our fault. It's simply the fact that these are not things that were talked about, discussed, or taught in most Tai Chi classes. The reasons for that I've dealt with in some of the other videos. They're historical, the Boxer Rebellion, the Communist Revolution, blah, blah, all that kind of good stuff. So I would like to start going back to these basic principles, right? Because there's things that keep popping up that are these little bits of information that we have that surround Tai Chi, surround this kind of Chinese martial art world. And it's time to bring them all together to reconstruct, essentially, the way of training that leads to a proper Tai Chi. So what needs to first of all be identified is what are the weaknesses that need to be bridged, right? So it's very much like Jurassic Park, where you use toad or was it? Yeah, I think it was toad DNA that was inserted into the missing pieces of the DNA of the dinosaur DNA, so to reconstruct a full dinosaur. So it's the same kind of thing where we need to find the DNA in other practices to reinsert it into the Tai Chi practice, so that we start making a bridge. We start recreate what Tai Chi actually was, because, for example, we know that Tai Chi was supposed to be one of the greatest martial arts that came out of the middle of the 19th century in China. Right? That's why Tai Chi became popular, because it was the most effective martial art. Is Tai Chi an effective martial art today? No. So something happened. Something is missing. So we need to plug that back in. We need to find... We're not going to be able to find exactly what Tai Chi was. Right? I think that's gone. But we can find elements that can fit within that gap that would allow it to then kind of revitalize Tai Chi itself and bring it back to close to what it was. So we have hints like, for example, in some of the older texts of the Young Family, where they talk about the social aspect and the martial aspect. So these are two terms that are really about internal work and internal development and external development. So martial as in the actual fighting style. And what you see is that they always say that both are necessary. If you only do one, the social or the martial, so only internal work and forget about the martial, then you are essentially not doing Tai Chi, right? Because you need both, they both feed each other. So in some ways, it's the internal and external need to work together. And this should not be a surprising idea, because this is essentially the core of a lot of Taoist thinking, that everything essentially co-generates each other, right? So whether we're talking about Qi and Jing and Shen, these are all connected things, and you can't separate one and develop just one without affecting the others. So we know that there has to be a balance between the internal work and the external work, that the martial aspect is actually necessary. And when you start thinking about it, it makes sense, because, for example, we keep hearing about the intent guides the Qi, so Yi guides the Qi. When the mind moves, the Qi follows. Well, what is the mind supposed to be doing? What is the mind supposed to be focusing on? Well, what it's supposed to be focusing on is the martial aspect. So when you're doing the form, you're focusing on the application, right? And this fight that you're having with this invisible partner. Why? Because if in your mind you have a clear application, then there's a clear direction for the internal energy for the Qi to move. So you need that clear application, that clear sense of application, in order to guide the Qi correctly. So you have to know what the applications are. If you don't, and you're just moving the arms through the air, it's very nice, it feels very good. But if you don't have a clear sense of, for example, what part of the arm is blocking, right? Which direction is the energy that you're throwing, then the mind, the Yi, is not guiding the Qi. Because you're moving here and everything stops, the Qi flow stops at the skin. And maybe it feels good, and it does, right? But that's just a Qigong exercise. You're not actually doing Tai Chi. Tai Chi would require that you know what the block is, for example, and when you throw, so you throw the energy, you punch, you strike, that strike goes beyond your own fist. Because now you're sending energy out, right? So that's the purpose of the form. That's why we go nice and slow. That's why the moves are applications, so that your mind can be engaged in a fight, so that you're moving the energy throughout the body and it goes beyond your own skin, essentially, right? So that's an example of the social and the martial kind of working together, internal and external working together. But there's all these other areas where some of the knowledge has been either de-emphasized or forgotten. But for example, I know that Master Wang Yin, who taught the hidden tradition of the Yang style, he mentioned in his book, the Qi is gathered in the bones and emitted through the bones and then through the soft tissues. The idea of Qi being in the bones is not new. There's a whole chunk of Qigong and Neigong that's dedicated to the cleansing of the marrow and all that kind of stuff. So it's a specific subset of Neigong exercises is gathering Qi in the bones. So why was it mentioned in a Tai Chi book that the gathering the Qi in the bones? we tend, at least the way I was taught, and through all the teachers I've ever had of Tai Chi, they talk about maybe the lower dantian. Sometimes they want to talk about one dantian, but none of them have mentioned bones. None of them have mentioned the fact that actually you're supposed to be gathering qi in the bones so that when you emit qi, right, it's not the lower dantian which is engaged, it's actually the bones. And it starts making sense when you start thinking about, oh wait, there's supposed to be these connection and these the foot pushing against the ground and that traveling through the body and then being emitted through the hand. Well, notice that the one thing that's not engaged there is the lower dantian, but the bones are. So why aren't we talking about the use of bones and energized bones through Tai Chi? And the fact that we need to have, so this comes from a different tradition, but of using energy, letting it relaxing, like extreme relaxation. Why are we keep being told to be relaxed in Tai Chi? Well, there's a whole system of extreme relaxation so that the Qi can travel through the soft tissues and out so that you can have these kind of control of the opponent. Like when you see these videos of people just kind of pushing somebody back without barely a touch, that's what they're doing, right? So basically you're transmitting your Qi through the soft tissues into your opponent. The qi comes out of the bones, goes through the soft tissue into your opponent. Again, and now you have this idea that I just mentioned about how in the form we're training with having an imaginary opponent because we're training our minds to guide the qi outside of the body. So that when we fight, we can use these skills of transmitting body through the soft tissues, transmitting the qi through the soft tissues so that you can control your opponent. It's the exact same thing. It's the same principles. So the form is training us to do these specific skills. So we have to start integrating them, right? So this is where you see the split between the internal and the external, the social and the martial. All right. So these are specific set of skills that then we need to learn. And at the same time, coming from the martial side, we need to start thinking about that because this again is the trap. So we've, in the last, 5 years or so, there's been a Chinese martial artist. He's an MMA fighter who's basically been challenging all these kind of so-called masters to fights and just beating the shit out of them, just ridiculously quickly, just beating them. Supposedly these are all like Tai Chi masters and all that kind of stuff. Well, when you think about it, of course he's beating them. So even these skills that I just talked about, right, where you can use your qi and you transmit it through the soft tissues into your opponent so that you can shake him and make him drop, which is true, by the way. That is a skill that you can develop. What tends to happen is people go, oh, look at this skill. It's fantastic. Now I can, just by touching somebody, I can make them fall. I'm now invincible. No, that's not true at all. Because in all cases, these skills that you have, like, oh, now I'm transmitting my qi through into my partner's body and I can move them. Well, it requires you to be relaxed. It requires you to have contact. It requires you to have that moment where you're receiving energy and then you're sending it back, all that kind of stuff. Well, if somebody punches you in the face, you don't have time to do any of that. Right? So it's a useless skill if you don't also have the basic skill of blocking, of stepping out of the way of a punch. The control that you have, so the sending of energy, controlling your opponent's body, works only if, so you've trained to remain relaxed in the middle of a fight. So you need to have fighting experience. You need sparring experience. It works only after you've controlled, you've touched, and you've done all of this exercise of like dropping energy and sending it back and all that kind of stuff. And so you have to be able to do that in a split second in the middle of being punched, right? So the reality is that is a skill that's built into Tai Chi, but can only be applied if you have the other basic martial skills of blocking, deflecting, so that you block a punch, you survive the first punch, you've blocked it, now you have contact. Now you can do your special magic trick of controlling your opponent's body. But if you don't have this skill, if you don't have the reflex of blocking a punch that's coming to your face, you're never going to be able to apply that skill, right? So that's one of those like major, it's a gap in our understanding or the way that we think about Tai Chi. Because even if we buy into the most kind of the wildest stories about Tai Chi, like for example, controlling your opponent with your own chi. It's forgetting the fact that at some point somebody's punching you in the face. Right? We have to start thinking in that way. So, okay, somebody's punching you in the face. Can you block? Do you have a basic block as one of your basic skills? If you don't, none of that matters. Right? And so this is where, again, we see from those writings from the Young family, needing the civil and the martial, needing both. You have to be able to block. Once you know how to block, then you can do your other skills. Right? You can, if you forget about the martial, then all the skills that you've developed about controlling your opponent and all that kind of stuff are useless. They won't work because you've just been punched in the face. Right? So even if you're not interested in learning Tai Chi to fight, even if you're not going to go into a bar and start, bar fighting and all that, you have to know that there's an arc of learning. There are a certain set of skills that need to be known in order for Tai Chi itself to work. And what happens when you start integrating all of that together, when you start thinking in those terms, is that the quality of your Tai Chi changes drastically. Instead of just moving the hands through the air, and it's very pretty, you start thinking about, okay, my energy is going there. It's going down. Not in my hands. I'm not holding a ball. I'm throwing, dropping, pushing out. Now your intent is outside of you. And now your Tai Chi is very different. Now dropping feels different. Now you can really work on that bounce, the pung energy, bouncing off the body. You're receiving energy and then bouncing it back. All that starts to feel very different. The form itself starts to feel very different. Energy is now moving in a very different way. Now you're doing proper Tai Chi, right? So what I would like to do, and this is my goal for the next decade, is identifying all these gaps and filling them in. So one of the big gaps, for example, is Chinese wrestling, right? We should be using Chinese wrestling as a map on how to actually use push hands. Why? Because they're cousins. They speak the same language in terms of movement. And we can see in Chinese wrestling moves that are in the form. So we can look at Chinese wrestling and go, okay, that's what push hands should look like. It should look like this Chinese wrestling with intermediate steps, but it's a way of learning on how to do all of this so that we can get to Chinese wrestling. We should also have on the other side a more structured Neigong and Qigong practice, because there are certain skills that we should know. For example, tapping into the Qi in the bones and things like that. That is something that we should all be familiar with when doing the form. Because the form itself has these moments where you're engaging the bone structure and other moments where you're engaging the soft tissues, right? We should know the difference between that. So that's the goal. So what we'd like, if you have any thoughts, resources, anything like that, please mention them in the comments. Directions where we should be looking as Tai Chi practitioners, places that we should investigate, specific knowledge that we should know so that we basically start talking about the same thing. We should all be able to talk about the Bagua and the movements. We should be able to, that should be our language. So that's one thing. I had several videos about that. But also what are specific aspects of Neigong that we should all know as Tai Chi practitioners. What are specific aspects of self-defense and fighting and wrestling that we should all know so that we can all talk about Tai Chi in a correct way, essentially, with a fuller understanding of what Tai Chi should be. Because right now, at this point, I see people just moving the hands through the air and I'm like, this is not Tai Chi. And it bores me, frankly, because it's not good. It's not interesting and it's not good. So we need to make Tai Chi interesting again. We need to kind of dig in. So leave a comment below. Thoughts, even if you don't know of anything, but leave a thought and leave a comment and let's start this journey.